Welcome to episode 28 of As Long as the River Flows, a Keepers of the Water podcast. Episode 28 is part one of a three-part series on the decolonization of our diets and reclaiming traditional foods. Food sovereignty traces back to our original teachings to learn about the connection between the land and our food supply and connection to community through traditional foods. Decolonizing our diet means incorporating traditional foods to preserve and nurture our mind, body, and spirit, and eliminate diseases that have long impacted Indigenous peoples. In part one, we hear from Jared Williams. Jared is a passionate Indigenous Foods educator who spent much of his youth with his late grandmother immersed in Salish culture. After graduating from culinary arts school, he spent a decade working in restaurants across Vancouver Island before deciding to move back home and take on the role of Elder's kitchen manager at the Quw'utsun tribes. After more than a decade of cooking for his elders, he now works as an Indigenous food educator, writer, and consultant. Most recently, Jared won several Canadian online publishing awards. He was also nominated for the 2022 BC Multiculturalism and Anti-Racism Award and led the first smoked salmon project conducted by the First Nations Health Authority. That proved that traditional salmon smoking techniques are safe and effective for food preservation. When he is not working on furthering Salish food sovereignty, Jared spends his time with his wife and children. But first, we hear from Keepers of the Water Executive Director Jesse Cardinal, who introduces the idea of food sovereignty and gets us started.
We've been working on food security and food sovereignty for a long time. In 2015, Keepers of the Water hosted a gathering called We Are the Land, and a lot of Treaty 6 communities participated in that. And so we had gardening workshops, we had straw bale home workshops, all kinds of things, because we know that access to clean water is a necessity to be able to grow our own food, and growing our own food is a necessity to have food security and food sovereignty. But on the other side of that is being able to be on the land to harvest our foods as well. Because we're not only farmers, like we are farmers, but we're not only farmers. We harvest medicines and berries and the animals. And because of our violent forced removal from the land, which was intentional, that disconnected us from our land. And so if you guys don't know the history, learn the history. There's lots of information of how Indigenous people, First Nations people, and then the Métis people were violently and forcibly removed from the land. And so when we were on the land, we were healthy. We had rich diets, and so we had very diverse and lots of things to eat. And so we hear stories of like our people would live until they were in their hundreds. That was common. There was no such thing as diabetes. There was no such thing as cancer. These are all new things that have happened in probably the past 50 years or so. And even my dad said, and because he's like that generation connected to the older generations, the canned food. He thinks that when canned food came in, and that was when they forced people onto what they call reserves. So, like, they rounded up First Nations and they forced them on these reserves. You couldn't leave. You had to get a pass from the Indian agent. Even gardening your food was like completely controlled by the Indian agent. And so if you were a good gardener and you were doing really well, then you would get less food rations, and they would not allow you to sell it. And if you did, they had complete control over who you sold it to, how much, and of course they would take a cut. Completely just awful, So Canada has a lot of making up to do in that area. Here we are today. So, we're reclaiming our lands, we're reclaiming our teachings, we're reclaiming our knowledge systems, and we're reclaiming our foods. And so that's what we're going to talk about today with Kevin and Jared.
And now we pick up with Jared Williams, Indigenous food educator, writer, and consultant.
Hey, Sibnasiya, Sibnasiya, Sibnasqualmo, Sibnashwalaqua, Ainta, Walmosne, Qwustenuxun. That's my name part down here in the corner part. Qwustenuxun. Everybody with me. Qwustenuxun. Easy breezy. Siam skukata walmo allens I chitsel lalamegen at the walmo allens at the walmo klaken. Oh, haita kasiam nasia. Oh, haita. Hello, everybody. I'm Jared Qwustenuxun Williams. What I was just telling everybody was that I am a chef and a Indigenous Foods advocate, I guess is probably the easiest translation, but that I've worked with our foods as long as I'm able to remember. Even as like a young child, we all worked together to eat, right? But on that, I was raised by my grandmother, who was this incredible matriarch that had at least 3 generations within her home all the time. And so there were always lots of other children. There was always, like my aunties and my uncles there, and we would always be working on something, whether or not we were repairing our dip nets to go fishing in the river, or if we were having hang up salmon. We were always working as one. Even like the young children, we all worked. We all had jobs. I can recall all of the children in the house, and how the elders are when there's all those young ones in the house. All the young ones get all the way loud and they say stuff like, "Asha, go on, everybody get outside." So we'd be running on our way out the door, and she used to like to reach in there and say, "No, you, Jared, we got work to do." I used to think I was always in trouble. I didn't know why I always had to do work. Everybody else was allowed to go outside. Everybody else was allowed to go across the road, and I had to go visiting. We used to go to all of the other elders' houses, and we used to have to listen to the language and to have all of our foods. And when I was young, I thought I was in trouble. But as I grew older, I realized that, she was trying to ready me for something. I was probably one of the last children that she was able to raise, because all of my aunties and my uncles had to go to residential school. And so I was probably the one child that she had a chance, to raise all the way through. So I was really lucky that way. But when I left home to go off to become a chef, I went to culinary arts and all these restaurants and things. But everywhere I went, we didn't have access to our traditional foods. There were no traditional foods. It was what I was raised with all of a sudden didn't exist. I even had this one chef in this really fancy restaurant I was at try to explain to me that cedar plank salmon is our traditional food. And I laughed and I was like, we didn't have convection ovens. I don't know how we could have that. But he was saying, no, that's the way you ate. So anyway, I realized everybody out there was crazy, and I ran away home as, you just heard, to become the elders' chef, where I learned a lot about how, at least in our province of BC, a lot of our traditional foods are not regulated in a way that we're allowed to have them, right? The food regulation here is specific, that anything used to be served has to be run through a registered supplier. And a lot of, the relatives I have aren't registered suppliers. And so we can only use, what's commercially available. And so as the elders chef, I had to try to use commercially available foods. While I was there, I was trying to get our traditional smoked salmon to the elders at the elders feast hall here back home. And yet these provincial regulations, were always in the way. And so I worked with the First Nations Health here to show the world, I guess, that the ancestors already knew how to look after all of our fish. And so all I had to do was to use the traditional techniques I learned provides some samples. And then the CDC here, was able to say, oh, yes, like this is a effective technique, for preserving salmon. But we already knew that because we have been using it here for thousands of years. And so just trying to help regulators realize that we already really know what we're doing. And so in, this example here, I want to try to highlight how traditional foods like our smoked salmon here on the West Coast, the reality is that the more we use these like traditional foods, the more we support who we are. When we have smoked salmon to eat, it's usually with some kind of a fat. And when I was young, it was usually with a lard that we would have it out. But I can recall always asking, like, did we always used to have lard? No, of course we didn't have lard. The elders would reference all these other fats. We had whale fat and like seal fat and bear fat, all of to rehydrate the like dried salmon. And, the elders actually, they like to like joke that it really helps to lubricate it, like on the way in and on the way out if you have all that extra fat. But that in order to have it, it was also usually boiled, right? After it's all the way like dried, in order to rehydrate it, we would usually boil it on the stove. And in a yesteryear, once again, we didn't have a pot. And so how do we used to heat up our water? Well, we used to use a bentwood box with hot rocks in order to heat up all of like the water on the inside of the box. And so it's a little bit easier nowadays, but always trying to remember how do we used to do these things. If you wanted to eat smoked salmon and you had to cook it, you would like first have to actually smoke it. And so you have to know how to design a smokehouse. What would you use to light your fire? How do you look after that like fire? How long is it in there? How do you cut and hang salt and like dry it? That information, because out here it actually, we leave our salmon in the smokehouse for just about a week long. And if you want to be able to dry a salmon, you got to harvest one. You got to know which one you require. Do you want a chum salmon or a Chinook salmon or a sockeye salmon? And why? Why do you want which one? And when do they run within the river? And how do you know which one? Do you want a male or a female? And why do you need each like gender and like how are they used? And then you need to know where to harvest and when to harvest. And you have to know how to harvest. Yet, if you want to harvest any of these things, you have to have the appropriate tools. And if I want to use a traditional fishing spear, I have to have one. And they're not commercially available. They're not at like a Walmart or anything. So you have to know how to make it. You have to know what tree you use and when to harvest it and then how to carve it and how to design the handle and the spear points and all those things. You have to have all of that information. And when you're working with the elders to learn all of this information, we learn our language. We learn what the names of these like trees are, what the names of the salmon are, and how they all weave together. And that we learn all this, as I was like referencing earlier, when we are young, right? When I was living in my grandmother's house, we would go like fishing all the time, but I would have to repair a broken spear. Like the uncles would arrive home and go, oh, hey, look at this, nephew. And I'd look and I'd say, what is it, uncle? And they go, look at my spear handle. It's all wrecked. And I'd go, yeah, okay. And they go, Asha, you have to repair it. You're the youngest one. I go, I don't know how to do that. And they go, here's how you do this and X and Y and Z. But they'd only ever like to show you once. You'd only ever get it once. And then for years, they just go, oh, here it is. And it would be all the way wrecked. And it was just up to you. You'd have to learn all of these like things. And then once you already knew how, it was up to you to actually like do the jobs. And so when we're young, we learn about all the different like tools and how to harvest and how to dry and how to cook and how to eat all of these foods and how the language weaves into it. And yet, at the end of it all, if we don't eat smoked salmon, none of that happens. All of that information, all of the language, all of the knowledge, all of the what to harvest and, like when to harvest, it won't happen. And when I was a kid, every house on the reserve here had a smokehouse, every one of them. I'd say now there's maybe 8 or 9 of them on the whole of our res, and there used to be hundreds. And so even out in, like the world here now, when we had to, I live here on the island, but if we had to like Victoria, which is the capital of our province, there are no Indigenous restaurants. There's all these other hundreds of them, millions of restaurants. There's no Indigenous restaurants. So in order to support who we are, we need to eat our food. And this is exactly why on the left hand of this, you can like see how freaking like happy he is. It's my son, and that's his first salmon. And it's not, like the most attractive. It was, like a little bit old and, like we didn't eat it because it was really old, but he was so happy. Look at him. He's thinking about that. And now every year he's always, oh, Dad, are we going to go fishing? And I say, well, if you want to go fishing, you got to learn how to use it. So he has to learn everything I just walked over with you if he wants to do this, and he wants it. And so we need to revitalize all of this. And, so I live pretty much on the edge of the river here in Quw'utsun, and we rely on the river like for everything. And if you look here, you can see I'm working on a weir. If you look to the upper right, that's a weir. Now, weirs used to run across the river here for thousands of years, but there are no weirs here anymore. They are technically illegal. Now, if you look at that weir, it runs almost all the way across the river. It isn't all the way across the river. It only runs the majority of the way across the river to allow the other salmon to travel upriver. And so on our river, there would have been at least like 6 weirs. And so a weir is an opportunity to run all the way across the river to keep all of the salmon to your himself, right? If you were to have it all the way across, they wouldn't actually like travel up anymore. They'd all be yours. But in all of these like generations, that never happened. Nobody ever decided to harvest all of them to themselves. Everyone realized that there were all those other weirs up the river that had to eat as well. So everybody always left room to let all of their salmon travel all the way upriver. And in this one image here, my youngest, he's actually asking me, what are you doing, Dad? I said, oh, like I have to make a weir, son. I said, learn it. Laughed. I said, it's in here. It's on the inside of you, son. You don't have to learn this stuff. This is, this is you. This is inside you. And he looked at me and he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, I'm using a rock off the edge of the river and the tree branches off the edge of the river. And you just easy as having to actually like do the work. I said, son, you don't always have to read a textbook. It's all on the inside too. He says, okay, Dad. He said to me, when was the last weir here in the river? And I said, it's been over like 50 years, son. This is the only one. And he says, oh, okay, Dad. But he doesn't realize he's watching the first weir in 50 years, to actually like happen on the river. He just thinks, okay, Dad, because it's the way that he lives, right? This is everyday life. We go harvesting, we go like fishing, we like to eat all these foods. And so we need to reinvigorate our traditional food system to save ourselves, our culture, and our language. So I just want to say, hey, oh, hi, tap, yeah. Hey, oh, hi, tap.
That was Jared Williams. Thank you for listening. To find out more about Keepers of the Water or to help support the cause, check out keepersofthewater.ca. If you want to keep up to date with all our new content, make sure you like our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you want to be the first to hear new episodes of As the River Flows, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. Miigwech.